migrants in general are one of the most vulnerable groups to report violence. At national level, let me tell you that the statistics show that just 10% of people that are victims of a crime in Mexico report it. Only 10%. That means that we have 90% of crimes that are not being reported. And that is for Mexicans. But migrants, they fear to report. Why? Because they don't trust in the authorities, because they don't know if by reporting they will have extra trouble or they will have to stay in the place, and what they want is to keep moving to the north. So it is a big problem, no, to try to document the scope of sexual violence and the ability to identify and to help people to report violence.
The opinions of the guests and host are their own and do not represent the opinions of Ironclad, the Border Patrol, or the Department of Homeland Security.
We cut through the partisan talking points. We're not interested in perpetuating fear. We're interested in seeking truth, hearing what's really going on America's borderland. Welcome to Borderland, an Ironclad original. My next guest is Alethia, who is a researcher and sociologist who studies the Mexican side of immigration, particularly in women's rights. I found this conversation to be something that no one has ever talked about on this show, which makes it very interesting for us to have a new perspective that we haven't been able to hear. We learn a lot about the Mexican detention camps and what that looks like. So please check it out. Thank you so much for being a part of the show. I really appreciate it. You know, this topic is, the topic of the border crisis is vast, and there's kind of these compartmentalized locations that I think is important to find these experts who like to focus on those. And one of the fascinating aspects of the border crisis of the cartel is the militarization of the Mexican border. And not only the Mexican military, but also some of the cartels are being more militarized. And also on the other side of the border, the American Border Patrol is becoming more militarized as well. And so I think this whole topic is very fascinating. If you wouldn't mind, for the audience, would you be able to give us a brief bio of your background?
Yes, of course. Thank you so much for the invitation. My name is Alethia Fernández de la Reguera. I am a social legal scholar in Mexico City. I'm based at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, and I am currently a visiting scholar at the University of Warwick in the UK. As a sociologist, I am always, or try to do a lot of field work. I try to be on the ground. And my research for the last 10 years has been based in the southern border of Mexico, particularly in the city of Tapachula, which is one of the most important entry points from Guatemala to Mexico. But
Awesome.
I also have conducted research in the US-Mexico border as well, particularly in Tijuana.
Right. In several of your articles, you talk about the militarization of the border. Can you just give me kind of just an overview of that topic for you? Well, let me start here. Let me start the question here. What drew you into focusing on the border issues and the militarization, within the context of the Mexico and the Mexican border?
Yeah. Well, I started working on immigration detention. So in 2017, I conducted an institutional ethnography inside the biggest immigration detention center in Mexico, which is in Tapachula. It's called Estación Migratoria Siglo XXI. And during that, this was before the caravans from Central America. I think it's important to try to give a bit of a context of how Mexico has somehow recently changed from being a country of origin and a country of transit to become a country of transit and destination of forced migrants or people that are forcibly displaced from their home countries, right? So my project in the Immigration Detention Center was more about trying to understand the functioning of the Instituto Nacional de Migración, National Institute of Migration in Mexico. But something happened in 2019, no? So, we need to remember, like in 2018, the first caravans from Central America came into Mexico. It was a very visible moment Do you remember there were this first caravan, October 2018, 3,000 people waiting in the main gate at the Mexico-Guatemalan border? And the reaction of the Mexican government, this was previously, the previous administration, the reaction was to close the border and to get more immigration agents and federal police guarding the border. And then very soon, things started to change because a new government arrived, and the government of Andrés Manuel López Obrador, the first thing they said is, this is going to be a humanitarian border, an open border. We're going to provide humanitarian aid to the forced displaced migrants. But actually what happened was that very soon, I don't know if you remember this, but I'm talking about May 2019, Donald Trump sends this tweets saying, if Mexico doesn't stop migrants in the southern border, we're going to increase the tariffs by 5%. And this is a key moment, because this is a moment where the Mexican government deployed the National Guard agents, which originally the National Guard was created in 2019 as a civil police, yes, but they were deployed to the border. And here is where I start to see that there are some changes in the way immigration detention is taking place in the border. And many people start talking about the militarization of border in 2019, as if 2019 is a turning point. But let me tell you, Vince, that is not really like that. I have been studying the phenomenon, especially because I conducted some interviews in an immigration detention center in Mexico City at the end of 2020, and I found a case of a woman from Honduras who was detained in Mexico City. She has previously been detained in the US, and then deported from the US to Mexico, detained in Ciudad Juarez, and she was raped by the military. So when I documented her testimony and her case, I was really overwhelmed trying to understand what were the additional risks that especially women were facing when they are crossing a country and crossing the borders with the militaries as the first respondents. So why I started to study militarization, actually it was because of this case that I found, and I wanted to understand what was happening with women and the detentions by the military, but also in the context of 2019, when for the first time, the Guardia Nacional are the ones that are deployed to guard the borders. What I have been doing, just let me tell you this brief context. I have been doing some research to try to understand the background of militarization, and it started actually in the 80s. The first accounts that we have on the militarization of the southern border, it's in the decade of the 80s with the civil war in Guatemala and the Guatemalan refugees arriving to Mexico, and the Mexican government targeting these refugees as threats for national security. In that moment, they were not saying national security, they were saying they are threats to the regime because they are left-wing and they might be political opposition and might create political opposition groups in Mexico. So the first documents that I found on repression and excessive use of force and even cases of torture from the military against refugees is from the 80s in Chiapas. Okay?
Yeah.
And then we have after, and the 80s it's interesting because Mexico usually likes to say that we are a country that we have open doors for refugees, as we did with Spanish fleeing from the Civil War, and with people coming from Argentina, Chile, and Guatemala as part of the dictatorships in the 70s and 80s. But in reality, what we see is that the Mexican southern border started to militarize in the 80s. Then in the 90s, you remember that we had the Zapatista movement in the south. So it is a very important decade to understand how infrastructure started to be part of the border, no? Like military infrastructure, and the army started to have clear places, no, to guard the border. So this is something that started 40 years ago. And little by little, we have been seeing how with different governments and administrations, there has been more investment from the US into the southern border of Mexico, investment in terms of technology, training, and what I explained that maybe we can start talking about that is not only the militarization of the border as a real presence and participation of the army, but about militarism. And that is like the culture of understanding of the culture to solve problems according to understanding the others as threats, as everything as issues of national security. So even if we are not talking about real presence of the army, we are talking about institutions such as the Border Patrol in the US that since its origins have been created as institutions through a logic of militarism.
Okay. This is fascinating. This is fascinating because it's probably some of the first times we hear Mexico has, some detention rules against immigration. Not that it's a secret, but I'm excited to talk more about that because it's a subject we don't talk about often on the show. I want to go back to when the first caravans were coming across, when the issue started more recently or so, right? When you said the Guatemalans who were coming across and the Mexico decided to kind of block the border, and then eventually the regime changed and they opened it as if it was a part of a humanitarian mission. How does so just so the listener understands, Mexico does have border policies and does not allow countries to come into their country illegally, just like America, correct?
Yes, Mexico has quite a comprehensive immigration law and also a very, in terms of the legal framework, a good framework for international protection. So in Mexico, arriving into the territory irregularly, it's a matter of administrative law. So there are sanctions for people that arrive irregularly. The sanction is immigration detention. Usually it should be a 36-hour detention to comply with the standards of administrative law in the Mexican Constitution, but in reality, people are detained not for 36 hours. We have documented cases of people detained for more than 10 months. So Mexico, in that sense, Vince, is adopting and has adopted or replicating the worst of the US policies in terms of the punitive policies against irregular migration.
Yeah.
We are the
Yeah. So
country in all Latin America with the highest numbers of immigration detention centers.
wait, say that last line one more time.
We are the country in all the Latin American region with the highest numbers of immigration detention centers.
What are those numbers currently right now? Do you have that?
Yes. We have around 50 detentions. There are around 50 detention centers in Mexico, and they are located around, the whole territory. That's why we talk about a vertical border. If I would be showing you the map, you could see that most of these detention centers are concentrated in the south of the territory, but we have them along central Mexico and northern Mexico. And in terms of numbers, Mexico has been breaking records for the last 4 years in terms of detention. So last year, 2023, Mexico detained 782,176 immigrants. So we're talking almost about 800,000 people that were detained in Mexico. And from this number, a tiny proportion is taken to alternatives to detention. So we're talking about unaccompanied children that, according to the law, cannot be detained in a detention center. But we have the number that in 2023, from that number that I told you, 782,176 immigrants, 566,300 were taken to a detention center. So almost 570,000 people in detention and 800,000 people detained. But there is one percentage that is taken to these facilities and particularly we're talking about unaccompanied children or children with their mothers.
So when you say detention centers, can you give me a good visual of what that looks like? Is it similar to our detention centers? Now, those were listing some of our detention centers when we used to detain any kind of migrants who came crossed illegally. They would be held in prison or jail facilities, similar to that. Is that the same over there in Mexico?
Yes, actually, I have conducted interviews with people that have been previously detained in the US. Very sadly, the conditions are very similar. Mexico is also like replicating the practices of the US, like privatization of services in prisons. So the detention centers, even though many people think they are shelters, they operate and physically they are as prisons, just as the one in the US, with some privatized services. And this is important to mention because like we have people that are working in detention centers, 24-hour surveillance, and they are from private security companies. And this is something that is really something to worry and to reflect on, because these
It's
people
controversial.
they don't necessarily have the training. I have interviewed people that told me 3 weeks ago I was working in a 7-Eleven, and after 2 weeks of training, they are working inside detention centers, and these are private companies.
Yeah, private companies working in detention is a very controversial subject because now you are funding a corporation that makes money off of detention, which can be very slippery slope, a very, I say, controversial topic. Interesting. So when when Trump mentions the Remain in Mexico um, treaty or policy that was put into place, Remain in Mexico, did that mean detention in Mexico?
It was, I think it would be a combination of two different phenomenon that we are seeing in Mexico right now. One side is, of course, immigration detention. That's why we have these numbers that have been increasing every year. And we are almost in having 1 million, close to get 1 million people detained yearly in Mexico.
Yeah.
But what happened with the Remain in Mexico policy was that there was this idea or this public discourse that Mexico was going to host migrants who were waiting for their asylum procedures in the US and were waiting in Mexico, that Mexico would provide like conditions to stay. And this was not the case. So we can say, Vince, that in one hand, what we have in Mexico is this massive arbitrary detention, but on the other hand, these places, public places where people can stay and wait for very long periods. So waiting, no, as a strategy of deterrence, it could be like the second deterrence policy. I would say the first deterrence policy is detention, and the second is people waiting for their asylum procedures either in Mexico or in the US, who have to live in very precarious conditions in open camps without any sanitary facilities, no? And we're talking about people that can stay for even 1 year. And this is more evident in the border states between Mexico and the US. So if we were thinking about, imagine how these places in Tijuana, in Ciudad Juarez, look like, well, we have camps of hundreds and hundreds of people waiting in the border. So that is another deterrence policy that started to or was strengthened with the MPP, the Migration Protection Protocols.
Why doesn't Mexico want to accept some of these migrants who are coming over for, I don't know, fear of persecution or forced out of their country due to fear?
It's a very interesting question. If we see the gaps that we have between the legal framework, no, or what is particularly specified in immigration law and international protection law, Mexico has a lot of mechanisms. I actually would tell you, it's not only refugee as a mechanism for international protection, but we have humanitarian visas. We have different mechanisms. But when you talk about the real implementation, then we see that we have to understand that this is about political will and about the relationship with the US. Because in terms of budget, for example, if you compare the budget of the National Institute of Migration or the National Guard that are guarding the borders with the budget of the Commission for Refugee in Mexico, it has a very, very small amount of money to be able to process all the asylum requests. So we have impossible to compare the size and the capacity to respond of the National Institute of Migration and the National Guard in terms of what the Commission for Refugees in Mexico is able to do. So we have very few people working there, with almost like a miserable budget, and it is actually the only available route for people that want to get a regular status. So this is something intentionally that the Mexican government has closed almost all the other mechanisms that legally people could apply to, and the only open mechanism is asylum. So it is quite contradictory because we keep saying that we are a country with a humanitarian policy in terms of migration. We keep saying that we have open borders for asylum seekers. Actually, Mexico was the only country that during COVID did not close the borders. For example, in all Latin America, Mexico kept the borders open and kept receiving asylum requests. The problem is not to present your asylum claim. The problem is that you are going to have to wait for 1 year and you are going to end up being fed up and going to the north because there are no options to work. You have to stay in the same place where you start your procedure. You have to stay along the process. And 40% or more of the asylum requests are presented in Chiapas, the poorest state of Mexico. So you have people that are stuck in Chiapas, and eventually they get tired and they keep organizing new caravans. That's why we have this phenomenon of caravans, that the latest caravans are not coming from Central America. They are organized in Mexico, and always with a promise of getting to the north. Yes, so we can say like two blocked moments, no? The southern border that tries to keep people in the south to prove the US government that we are actually incarcerating people and stopping them in the south. But then you also have the second very big blocked border that is in the north with the US.
Yeah, with the US and our own version of our own militarization of the borders that we have. It's an interesting topic because you mentioned, and I wanted to go back to the female that you were able to interview. I'm not sure if you're still in contact with her because we would love to interview her as well. But what motivated you to focus on the militarization of this subject is because of one woman who was trying to come across and then later was raped by the National Guard. Your big focus is the militarization and how you're against it because of multiple different reasons, corruption, and I guess almost like it can be considered as inhumane in some aspects. But I'd love to dig more into that aspect of it and what motivated you to focus on that subject.
Yeah, it is. It's a very interesting. Well, not interesting from an academic perspective. It's interesting, but I mean, it's a very controversial topic now because Mexico has militarized not only the border. Mexico has militarized public security. So in the last administration with Andrés Manuel López Obrador, we started to see different constitutional reforms. And the latest one was in October this year, just 2 months before, 2 months ago, some days before he left office. So we need to understand militarization of borders in the context of a country that has militarized public security, and that we know that at least for 3 administrations, the strategy to combat organized crime has been frontal and has been to put the militaries as the ones in charge of eradicating drug cartels. So on top of that, you have the militaries guarding borders, and this has very serious effects for migrants. So when I start to study militarization, of course, I start also to document cases of people, Mexican people, that have also been in serious situations, they have suffered serious human rights violations in hands of the military. And I am particularly focused now on checkpoints. I will tell you what am I studying about checkpoints, but just trying to go back because the question was what brought me to study militarization. I am a feminist scholar, and I always try to visualize and to try to understand the particularities of the different risks and the particularities of migrating as a woman, no? I have also worked with transgender women crossing the border of Mexico and trying to transit through Mexico. So this case that I found of this woman who is a very critical case because she was raped by the National Guard. Then it was a group of women. It was not only her. It was a group of 4 women. And the guards told them that they should strip naked and that they would put their rifles or their fingers into their vaginas. And if they didn't allow them to do so, they would be detained for longer. So after this happened, this woman with a group, they are taken to the facilities of the National Institute of Migration. And for 2 months, she's an immigration detention center in Janos, Chihuahua. And there are protocols. In Mexico, there are protocols when any woman goes into a migration detention center, she has to go through a medical procedure, not to identify if she has suffered sexual violence. That's what I tell you, Vince. If you see our laws, the laws look quite good. The problem is the implementation. She never got access to the medical service. When she wanted to see the doctor because she was having an infection, she went to the doctor and the doctor told her, you have the infection because you are too much. So there was also a lot of, not all the re-victimization and the criminalization is not only coming from the border guards, but also, this is something very common, that doctors inside immigration detention centers also work as the second police, no? And creating fear and punishing people that are in detention. So she never got access to the doctor. She never got access to any treatment. Nobody asked her, even though it was so evident, but nobody asked her if she was distressed because of something that happened during detention. Anyway, then she's taken to Mexico City to be deported. And that's when I met her after 2 months of detention in Chihuahua and then in Mexico City. And then she was deported. I lost contact with her. It was a very difficult case because it proves all the different layers of institutional violence. It proves also the great obstacles that women face to report violence, because according to the law, if she suffered any type of crime or human right violation in the hands of a federal agent, automatically she is entitled to have a humanitarian visa. So she would have never been deported. So this case proves a series of situations, no, that have to do with institutional violence, with sexual violence, with racism, no, and that's why I started to study what was happening when it is the National Guard, the ones that are the first respondents in this interaction with migrants and particularly women.
We don't just do the filmmaking. We do everything. We've taken a case study of over 30 projects that we've done over the past 15 years, and we put together what we believe is the most effective and efficient content funnel for brands. They need content on a daily basis. They need to be talking to authentic end users. We want your team to bring its most challenging problems and allow us and our team to apply our proven methods to your brand to take it to another level.
Is this very common? You know, this is one story, and you'll hear one story here and there. Even on the Mexican side, there might be something to a story like this. But, you know, this one story, is this common? Is this something that migrants, when they're coming across Mexico, they know to be very careful, to know that they might be in danger? I just want to know what the kind of conversation on the Mexican side is as migrants are coming across. Are they in fear for their lives as crossing through Mexico?
It is, unfortunately, we don't have enough figures in order to tell you numbers about how many women suffer sexual violence when they are in transit. But what we know, and this has been happening for decades, is that women from Central America, before crossing the Mexican border, or at the moment they leave their home place, they are traveling with condoms or with contraceptives because they know that at some point during transit they will suffer sexual violence. Usually, what NGOs have documented for many years is that sexual violence was happening during transit, and it was criminal organizations, or sometimes also the authorities, but mainly cartels, no? That because that's true. I mean, when you find people in the northern border, it's almost it's almost for sure that at some point during these routes crossing Mexico, part of the routes are operated by cartels. So sexual violence, yes, it is very common. What is not, for me, not so I'm sorry, because let me recapitulate. What I really don't know for sure is how common is that women are being raped by the military. If we try to understand the logics of deterrence and the logic of what's happening in general in Mexico, when I was talking about a country that is militarized, the drugs against cartels and organized crime, rape is something that is actually quite common. There are many cases that have even been to court and to the Inter-American court of, for example, indigenous women who have been raped by the military during certain operations. So my answer, I think it is quite common, but it's something that is not well reported. Migrants, in general, are one of the most vulnerable groups to report violence. At national level, let me tell you that the statistics show that just 10% of people that are victims of a crime in Mexico report it. Only 10%. That means that we have 90% of crimes that are not being reported. And that is for Mexicans. But migrants, they fear to report. Why? Because they don't trust in the authorities, because they don't know if by reporting they will have extra trouble, or they will have to stay in the place, and what they want is to keep moving to the north. So it is a big problem, no, to try to document the scope of sexual violence and the ability to identify and to help people to report violence.
It's very sad to hear. In working on the American side of the border, we hear about it often as well. We hear about in transport, whether coyotes or cartels or whoever it is has taken advantage of many different women. And so, I've heard a lot about it. I've never heard about it from the other side. So it's really great to be able to hear the information and learn more about the subject. My next question I have is about Claudia Sheinbaum, the new president. With the changes, if any, do you foresee Mexico's approach on the border control or the militarization changing in a positive way?
No. Let me explain a bit more. And I also do have other two topics that are related to the previous one. But
Please,
first,
whatever you need. This is your time.
let me first finish this other part that it was about the checkpoints.
Yeah.
And then we go to Sheinbaum, okay? So I think that what I would like to share with you is that it's not only about documenting sexual violence, but I would like to place the reflection of what does it mean to rape a woman, no? And I think this is very connected with a context where there are a lot of femicides. Mexico is a country where we have 11 women who are killed each day because of gender reasons. So there is clearly a context. It's not an isolated act, no, that a migrant woman is raped in the border. There is a context of extreme violence against women, extreme violence in terms of femicides and forced disappearances. So the bodies of women are becoming like the main target. When we try to understand militarized groups, there is a lot of literature showing that it was like a collateral damage, that when there was a military intervention, that sexual violence was part of what was an unintended consequence. And no, here is not that. I would say that the direct target and the direct deterrence policy is the bodies of women, no? And that's something that I just wanted to show, because I think we need to understand this within a context of a country where the extreme violence against women is a daily practice, especially, for example, in different areas that are close to migrant routes as well. It's generalized in the country, but we can say that in certain areas where organized crime operates, is also, we have higher in figures of femicides and disappearances of women, and these are the routes where the migrants are crossing.
Yeah, it's sad to hear. It sounds like, we've never really talked about that on the show. I've never had someone ever talk about the Mexican side of the immigration struggle, but also now hearing about the of these women. We've had several people talk about how women get, I would say, extorted for sex or used for sex and transport, or even as transfer as payment, right? I've heard in one interview that women would use their bodies as payment, and almost in the fact of forcefully, right? They had to before they could be allowed to cross. But in hearing in this subject, this is a very scary, fascinating truth that I'm excited to be able to talk about. When here's something that it's kind of confusing for some, for me at least. Mexico doesn't have a border patrol, right? Just like the army, like the American side does. We have a border patrol. Their focus is 100% immigration. That's what they do. Does Mexico have something like that? That's not the military?
Yes, Mexico. It is and it is not. It's very interesting. It is the Instituto Nacional de Migración, the National Institute of Migration. This institution was created in terms of administrative law, but they were created in the 90s also within a militarism, a culture of militarism, now with a set of values that are related to militarism. So you have these guys that are dressed with a semi-military uniform, but they are working in offices in Mexico City. So what has been, and they are the only ones that are in charge of detention, because it is administrative detention, but they don't carry weapons, but they have always operated in coordination with the federal police and now with the National Guard. So within the operations, you have this mixture, this combination of the first, supposedly, when it happens like that, because we also have detentions that are being carried on by many different actors without the Institute of Migration. We have detentions that are just in hands of the military, of the Navy. We have also the worst cases are when is the municipal police involved, because they don't have any protocols. They cannot do it. By law, they cannot detain migrants. The only authority that is entitled to detain is the National Institute of Migration in coordination with National Guard.
Interesting. So the National Guard does have arrest capabilities underneath the immigration process.
Yes, but just as the role
in
is
support
to support.
Of.
Exactly.
Yes. In support
They
of.
cannot do it on their own. However, we know it happens. And this case that I just narrated, it happened just with the National Guard.
So the National Guard, so I've gone down to the border. I've seen the National Guard staged on the other side of the wall, and their goal is to help deter immigration. They're there to deter immigration. At those staging locations, is it common to have a Mexican border patrol or a Mexican immigration officer there at the same time, or they're
Absolutely.
independently working?
No, they should be working together. And for example, when you have the deportations from the US, because it happened once that I was doing field work in Tijuana, and I was inside the facilities of the Institute of Migration. And the way it works is that Border Patrol Office literally gives a list to the Mexican agent, immigration agent. They receive the list with the names of people that are going to be deported. They open the gate and people get inside. And all the facilities are guarded by the National Guard. So it is like the combination. Mm-hmm.
So anyone that's coming across illegally from other countries, whether it be for asylum, whether it be for just looking for economic changes, can be arrested or can be apprehended on the Mexican side because they're not Mexican citizens?
Yes, and there are different ways that they can get a regular status. But what happens usually is that even though the Mexican authority can give them, for example, a document to transit for 30 days, because there are different ways to create a regulation status. No? So when you have someone that is irregular, is detention. Sometimes it's also you say, Alethia, why don't you have just one way to explain it? No, because anything can happen here, okay? But the usual way is detention. And after detention, the person is deported. Sometimes they are not detained. Why? Because you sometimes have thousands and thousands of people coming to the border, and with the caravans it happened, and there is simply no capacity to detain everyone. So they give them like a 30-day permit to transit to Mexico. They want to facilitate people going to the north, for example. But people will eventually be detained at some point, and the same authority destroys the document. It's very common that the authority doesn't respect the same document that the authority gave them. So you have people crossing Mexico, and they have a paper from the authority, and the authority doesn't recognize this, and they destroy the document. Sometimes they also destroy passports, destroy any official documents, and they are detained. So that's why we call it a vertical border. It is very difficult that people will be able to get to the north. How do they get to the north? We know that more clandestine routes with smugglers. So the only thing that you are creating here is a big business for organized crime and for the human smugglers, because people is so difficult to get to central Mexico and to keep going to the north with all these checkpoints and with all these detention centers, that eventually people will get other ways to do it. And these are the risks, no? Because we know that there are forced disappearances and people are kidnapped and a lot of extortions when they have to cross in territories that are operated by the cartels.
So why does the cartel makes a lot of money off human trafficking, off human smuggling. So at what point does the cartel it's just interesting to me, like because if I go to the border right now and I see 8 people cross, right? They hop the fence or they wade across the river to get access. They're not released from detention. Those are usually transported through with some kind of cartel, correct? Well, yes, that's usually.
I would, yeah, maybe. I mean, I have interviewed people in the northern border of Mexico, and most of them, they told you that at least part of the route, they suffered extortion, or they went through territories operated by the cartels. I don't know if necessarily all the way to the north, but at least in some points. Many people have been detained once or twice, and then they keep moving.
Yeah. And it's just fascinating to hear that there's a very similar situation from the American side on the Mexican side, but the Mexican side seems to have a lot more corruption. It's a lot less organized than what the American side is. Is that correct from your experience? You know a lot about the American side and how immigration works on our side?
Yeah. So I have interviewed people that told me, like, I was detained in the US. It's a system that dehumanizes, no? It's a system that is very cruel. But they say the difference between Mexico and the US is that in the US we have an immigration agent, and we know what's going to happen. They usually tell you are going to be deported, no? They said it is very humiliating because in the US they handcuff us. So they treat us like criminals. In Mexico, authorities don't handcuff migrants. But the great difference, they say, in Mexico, it's uncertainty. We never know what's going to happen. We don't know why we were detained. We don't know for how long. So I think that for me, one of the most important difference between both systems is the access to information. And yes,
Do they feel safer? They feel safer in America?
In America, people feel very humiliated, very criminalized, because they are being put in these freezers, no?
Correct.
And some people, for example, once I interviewed someone that told me, like, they were you imagine like in Auschwitz, like the Nazis, no? These people, it was in Texas, they were put in an immigration detention center and they told them, you are all filthy and you might have bugs. So we're going to, I don't know the word in English, but when you, can I say,
Desanitize or say,
yes, yes, like if you, like when you desanitize, but you know, when you have a plague with plants that you have pesticides,
yes.
they put pesticides on them to get rid of the bugs. So this thing, I was like, wow, this is something that I read testimonies, but in Auschwitz.
Yeah, I've never, so I've worked in the corrections world as well, and I've worked in a corrections facility that also had immigration. And what happens now every state is different, right? And everything, so I can't speak on all of it. We do arrest anyone who has broken the law. And so even in the case of someone who is seeking asylum, if they've crossed illegally, that's considered to break a law. So they do arrest them, especially before detention. And then, and then they're held and housed in corrections facilities. But the process is everyone gets the opportunity to take a shower, but in a jail setting, you're almost encouraged to. And so I'm curious to know about that more down the road. I'll look into that myself. But they have to feel a lot safer in the American version of it because they are protected a little bit more, because at that point, under our I would say under our arrest or in our possession, we by law are supposed to safeguard their lives, their lifestyles. And so as much as it might be humiliating in one aspect with handcuffs and treated like a criminal, because in the US it is considered a criminal offense, they are then treated with security and safety to make sure that they get 3 meals a day and that they get a good place to, I would say a place to sleep. I would say that, and medical attention. And so if I would if I had to choose one, I feel like the American side would feel a little bit more secure and safety, because the Mexican side of detention sounds to be very corrupt. And like you said, uncertainty of who knows if you're going to get past this portion to get to the next space. And so it's just fascinating to hear the two different, I guess, views of detention. And go ahead, please.
And I would add, maybe it's a protocol to sanitize people, but that for me, a sociologist, the interest part is how people giving a meaning to the situation, how they tell their story, and this
Understood.
feeling of feeling like I was full of dirt, of bugs, and they treat me as if I was just, and put me some pesticide. So that is what, for me, as a sociologist, I keep that narrative. I have also, in these same interviews that I was conducting in Tijuana, this is 2021, 2019. One woman told me that in the US, they also gave us just 1 meal a day. And I was also quite shocked, because my idea is similar to yours, that at least there is more certainty and less corruption in the US. I think means that we need to try to understand and get some people that are working in detention centers in the US to document deaths in immigration detention centers. But we know in the US, in the Mexican side, you know the case that happened in 27th of March 2023. 40 people died, burned in an immigration detention center in Ciudad Juarez. And this is one of the worst cases we have had for decades. And this detention center was operated by a former military. And there is an investigation on, and apparently the director of this immigration center, he gave the instruction of don't open the gate. And 40 people died. 40 men died burned in the immigration detention center. So in this sense, we can say both systems are very dehumanizing, but I think you might be right. Like there are some protocols that are better followed in the US. And in Mexico, the militarization has also complicated things. Yes.
Yeah.
And because we're talking about the institutions that work under the exceptionality of the law and a lot of discretionary use of the law. But on top of that, if you have a vertical command and you have these, these logics of the militaries, this can make things worse, right?
It's fascinating because so I'm a former military man in America. And we, so just because someone is military, it shouldn't mean that they have dehumanizing capabilities, right? I believe us in the military in America follow protocol as much as possible in the sense of we should be protecting those who are weaker than them, who are weaker. And so we defend those who need it in a sense. And in a humanitarian kind of position, so our National Guard at our borders should be protecting it's very that's a very I won't mention that one because that's different because the immigration situation is so different. But say in a humanitarian order, if our military is activated, say Hurricane Katrina, they're there to save and protect, help people. But on the Mexican side, it sounds more so they've turned into a very harsh punishment. But it in Mexico, illegal immigration is considered more of a not a criminal action, correct? It's more of an administrative action.
Yes.
So then if it's an
Yes.
administrative action, why is it such a serious posture by the military and law enforcement?
That's a question. I mean, you just nailed it. I mean, the point here is that even though it is a matter of administrative law, since Peña Nieto, so that means that for two administrations now, if you see the national security plan of the Mexican government, migrants are listed in one of the groups as national threats. So they are treated as matter of national security. So there is this big contradiction. So why do we have the National Guard or the militaries being the first respondents of migrants when these are forces that, as you say, also in Mexico in humanitarian situations, no, they are trained to protect, but they are also in the context of Mexico of having organized crime and the frontal war against drugs. These guys are trained to eradicate the other. The other is the enemy. No, so in this context of fear, I also think I'm working now. My research is on trying to understand the sociology of emotions and what role do emotions play in the implementation of policies. And there is a context of fear. These people work in very precarious conditions and with a constant fear. So it is very common, no, that instead of being a first respondent that protects the most vulnerable, if migrants are in the public discourse and in the plan of national security categorized as national threats, they are the enemy. So that's why
Yeah.
you have these operations. It happened also just 2 months ago that 4 migrants were shot. They were in a van. The van looked old and it looked suspicious. And as many other cases that happens also with Mexicans, in a checkpoint, they look suspicious and the National Guard don't think it twice and just shoots, right?
Wow.
So there is a whole context also to try to understand the serious human
I
rights violations against migrants.
Yeah, I see that now. Now if the military is told that they are protecting their nation's security, right? Their homeland security essentially, that's their mission. Well then yeah, then their posture is a little higher. Still doesn't make sense when it is an administrative issue and not a criminal action. So uh fascinating and it blows my mind. I've never heard any of this before, which I'm glad that you're here explaining it to me. And do you want to jump to the new president and why you believe there would
Yes,
be no
of course.
change?
Yes.
Yeah, because you would think that a female president would have more of a heart for the female transits that are coming across. They'd want to protect them more. And so I'm curious to see what you think.
Mexican president, she came to the office and she said, llegamos todas. That means we all arrived together, talking about female, no? Like women, we all arrived together. But actually, I mean, we see that it's not really happening, no? And in terms of migration, it's difficult because just some days before she took office, the last constitutional reform to uh, completely militarize the National Guard took place. So Claudia Sheinbaum takes an office with a country that is absolutely militarized, where there is no more civil police, and it used to be the federal police. She comes into an office where the militaries have a lot of power. the militaries in the last administration and even before, they are building infrastructure, airports. I mean, they are running a big business and a lot of power because they are in charge of many of public security in Mexico. And then we have on top of that the pressure of having Donald Trump back to office, right? So I do think that Claudia Sheinbaum has a very tough situation now to face. I don't think that, very sadly, I really don't think that the militaries are stepping down from the border protection and guarding immigration detention centers. Actually, I think that what will happen, and that's hopefully I am wrong, is that the nationality of migration will be even more diminished because more money, more budget, more strength will come to the National Guard, and the Institute of Migration will be in charge of the administrative part, but the enforcement of the borders is going to be, at least as far as I see, no, uh, with the National Guard. And we are almost going to launch a publication that is called Bajo la Bota. The first edition was published 2 years ago, and this is a report on serious human rights violations in hands of the military against migrants. Yeah. And we are showing that one of the most risky environments is checkpoints. And this is something that is being enforced. We're not seeing that it's actually the numbers of and the proliferation of checkpoints is increasing in Mexico. And checkpoints becomes a very dangerous spot to conduct racial profiling against migrants because they are placed in areas that sometimes are very isolated, uncommunicated. So many things are happening during checkpoints and it's difficult to have accountability. So I am not very positive, and I'm very sorry for this because I would like to give an answer that give us hope, but I don't think that Sheinbaum will be able to cope with the militarization of public security, with all the different, for example, situations with the cartels that are happening in the south of Mexico. We see Chiapas that is like in a very serious situation. So what we're seeing is more checkpoints, more militaries, and migrants becoming, as we know, the big business for traffickers and for organized crime. So everything is mixed together, right?
I wonder because we don't use our National Guard for immigration. We do have currently National Guard deployed to our borders in support of the Border Patrol and the border crisis. And they're not, just to make things clear, they're not deployed to engage on any kind of threat. They have the capabilities to, but they're there to support numbers. And that means more people manning cameras, more people observing high points or high locations for deterrence. Okay. They're supporting in the efforts of manning more technology to support the efforts of the Border Patrol. And I don't want to get that confused with actually patrolling the border and engaging on any kind of threat. That is not happening in our American borders. We don't use our military like that. Our military is used for outside of the country. The Mexican military is using internally of the country, which is very different. It would be almost a good idea for the Mexican government to establish a stronger border patrol that has a more human aspect and I guess understanding of how immigration works. Just like our border patrol. Our border patrol has gotten a really bad rap from the media, but our border patrol rescues many lives, has a lot of we don't you don't see our border patrol standing at the edge of the river pushing people back into the river. That's not how our border patrol mans our borders. We just implement the policy. So if someone crosses illegally, you don't see us shoot them for crossing illegally. We have to allow them into the country, and then we process them based on what the immigration policy has during that administration. Sometimes it is detention. Sometimes it's what we have now, right? You've seen the past 4 years has been 72-hour detention, but going released into the country on their own recognizance for notice to appear to see an immigration judge later at the time, right? At a later time. That's what we've done for the past almost 3 years on this administration. So I believe it would be better for Mexico to implement something of a different entity manning the borders other than the military, because I think the military brings a type of posture that is dangerous, or they're trained to, like you said, take out the threats. And if they're taught that immigration is the threat, well, then that's why they have a different posture towards immigration and not taking it as Mexico does, the administration issue, right? An administrative issue.
Absolutely. And also, I mean, there are cases of, I mean, not necessarily they are very well trained in terms of who is a migrant and what does a migrant need, no? They are there to provide and to eradicate organized crime and to provide public security. So many cases happen without even noticing that they are like interacting with migrants. So sometimes when there have been many cases of people, for example, that are stopped in checkpoints and they are not recognized as Mexicans because they don't speak Spanish. They are indigenous people from the south of Mexico. Well, yeah, because you have to, these people are not necessarily trained, and they also have a lot of discretionary use, and there are no clear protocols. They don't have also, they are very unaccountable. They don't have to be very accountable on how they do their detentions, the military. When it's the National Institute of Migration, they do have to present a report on each detention and when was it done, at what time, but the militaries don't. So they don't necessarily have the tools or the skills to do this, more like humanitarian tasks. They should be, but instead of that, they are like arbitrary, in an arbitrary way detaining people, right? So yeah, they shouldn't be guarding the borders. They shouldn't be the first respondents because they are not trying to be that. And especially not when we are talking about for displaced people from Central America. Also, Mexico receives migrants from African countries. I mean, you have a huge diversity, people that don't speak Spanish,
Yes.
people that are with disabilities, children, transgender people. You have to have a force that is trained for that.
Yeah, and I don't know if the Mexican government is ready to overhaul the immigration system with some kind of agency that's going to be capable of doing that. That sounds more of a challenge, but it also sounds like a counterintuitive to the corruption in the drug trade, which would they would have to face as well, how to combat the cartel when they're smuggling individuals as well. Oof.
And you know what's fascinating, just to close with this idea,
Please.
that if you see the like national service, the authority that is most trustable in Mexico is the military. We have national service on victimhood, and they say that they trust much more the military or the Navy, for example, than state police or municipal police. So it's interesting because in average, a Mexican person tells you that they trust the militaries. But people that are more like human rights defenders or families of disappeared people in Mexico, they are the ones who are the real activists against the militarization of public security in the country. So it's a very interesting topic to be discussing now.
It is. You know, it makes me a little bit more, even more kind of understanding of the challenges that our immigration side has with the Border Patrol and what they do daily, and that might be missing slightly in the Mexican side, and why there is so much corruption with that. It's a great topic. I really appreciate it. We can go on for another hour. I'm probably gonna have to invite you back to talk more about the subject, but thank you so much for being a voice for those who don't have one. Thank you so much for being on the show with us. And this is a very important topic, and I support you in any way. If there's anything we can do for you, please let me know. I would love to continue to support you on this subject, especially, trying to protect women is something high on my list, and so I'm very interested in any kind of studies that you have moving forward. And if there's anything you need from me, please reach out.
Thank you so much, Vince. Yes, I will let you know when we launch the report on Bajo la Bota. That is going to be maybe at the beginning of next year. And yes, I would love to keep in touch. It's always important to have this binational dialogue. And for me to be able to share my research also with an American audience is very important.
Thank you for listening to Borderland, an Ironclad original. I am your host, Vincent Vargas. Please don't forget to tell your friends, Like it, share it. And if you have any interest of any subject in this space, please put that in the comments and we'll try and get to it. Thank you very much. Take care.